All right, Numbers 14, let's call this one Beach House Part 2, because in many ways it is a continuation of what we saw way back in Exodus 17, where we noticed that the people of Israel, in all their grumblings, had distanced themselves, at least emotionally, from what was going on with God, because as they continued to grumble, he was growing more and more angry, but they didn't seem to really care, because the more they grumbled, the more they got what they wanted, regardless of the emotional impact on God and or Moses. And so we have taken a pause, because much of what they were actually good at, we've given them credit for. They were great at making donations for building the tabernacle, for doing all that was called for them to do in erecting the tabernacle, anointing the priesthood, blase, blase, blase. So it wasn't all bad. But what we're seeing now is, now that the things that they are really good at are going to draw to a close, God's going to put them back in a position where we're going to see what's really going on in their character, how far they've grown and how far they haven't. And as we've already seen, as soon as they set out on the move, they get right back to complaining. And so it seems that they have not changed. And so likewise, we are going to also see another thing that we might want to pay attention to out of these 10 times. And that is literally what God is going to call it. We really could have subtitled it these 10 times, because God is going to say in around verse 22, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times. He's going to say they're not going to get to see the promised land. So ultimately, of those 10 times, at least 6 or 7 of them, I think, are really times in which they are literally grumbling against Moses, which implicates something else that we see in what God does in working through us. See, God doesn't always come to us in a majestic form. There are times when clearly he does, and we see people falling down his feet as though dead. But ultimately, a lot of times he comes to us in subtleties, and we often talk about at the end of Jesus' ministry. Matthew 25 talks about a simple test that everybody really has to pass, and it is, how did you treat him when you didn't know it was him, when he was poor, maybe lacking shelter, maybe locked up, blase, 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 in a lot of different forms we wouldn't necessarily notice him in. And those who treated him with love and respect and kindness were those who were considered lambs in that story. But those who rejected him when it didn't look like he amounted to much were called goats. And that's the famous parable of the sheep and the goats. Likewise, we're going to see the Hebrew writer in chapter 13, around verse 1, advise us, let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for there are some who have entertained angels unawares. And so going back to Moses, when they were complaining against Moses, they didn't realize that they were really complaining against God, because Moses didn't want to go in the first place. He was simply telling the people the things that God had commanded him to say. And it goes back to something we noticed about Moses in previous chapters, and that is he was considered to be faithful. And one of the ways faithfulness is seen is in a servant who faithfully reflects what his master is asking him to do. And one of the ways in which Moses seems to have been extremely faithful is that he was only saying what God had sent him to say. And so ultimately what we are seeing here is a situation where no matter how much Israel was getting its way, no matter how much they had put on pause their tendency to complain, the underlying tendency for them to complain to get what they wanted had never really gone away. And so what's the lesson for us? Once again, ultimately, God is calling each and every one of us to work on, as we've said in lessons past, the stuff we don't do so well. Oftentimes, life is going to give us opportunities to neglect that character work that we all need to do. And the temptation can be to believe that we've simply gotten better when we've simply gotten busier. So in many ways, the question is the same, much like we dealt with back in Beach House. If we are getting what we want at the emotional expense of the people around us or even God, what have we really won? And so once again, our temptation can be twofold. On the one hand, to prioritize our ambitions, our wants, and our desires above the emotional needs of the people around us. Once again, wearing out and exhausting people and losing track of the way in which God's not going to make a special appearance to us, but in the way that we exhaust the people around us, losing track of the way that we're actually exhausting God too. So as we often say, God's best to you as you go forward in him, properly prioritizing people above simply getting their needs met.